There is a powerful idea deeply rooted in modern spirituality, the belief that the more conscious you become, the easier it is to love, without limits, without resistance, without conditions. But for many spiritually awake individuals, love doesn't bring lightness. It brings exhaustion, confusion, and a quiet sense of losing themselves along the way. They feel deeply. They notice what isn't said. They sense emotional shifts before words are spoken. And because of that, they learn early how to hold space, how to understand, how to forgive, even when it hurts. They call this love. They call this awareness. They call this spiritual growth. But at some point, something stops making sense. Because if this is higher love, why does it drain them? Why does it require silence around their own needs? And why does loving this way often leave them feeling farther from themselves, not closer? Carl Jung noticed something deeply unsettling about this form of love. He observed that what presents itself as unconditional love often doesn't come from wholeness. It comes from the absence of psychological boundaries. For Jung, real love doesn't emerge when two people dissolve into each other, but when two whole individuals can remain in relationship, without disappearing in order to keep the bond alive. And this is where many spiritually awake people become confused. They don't struggle with loving. They struggle with remaining whole while loving. This video is not about rejecting love, and it's not about becoming cold, distant, or closed off. It's about understanding why, for the spiritually awake, loving unconditionally can quietly turn into self-abandonment, and why the next stage of awakening may not be about loving more, but about loving without losing yourself. For many spiritually awake people, love begins as devotion, not obsession, not dependency, but a sincere desire to understand, to support, to remain present. They don't love halfway. They love with awareness, with sensitivity, with a deep emotional intelligence that allows them to sense what others feel, sometimes even before those feelings are fully conscious. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifts. Love stops being a meeting between two individuals and becomes a quiet responsibility. They begin to monitor moods. They adjust their tone. They soften their needs. They postpone difficult truths in the name of harmony. And without realizing it, love starts asking for something dangerous. Their center. Carl Jung would not have called this love. He would have called it a loss of psychological orientation. Because when a person consistently moves away from their own inner position in order to maintain connection, the relationship no longer rests on wholeness. It rests on self-erasure. This is why so many spiritually awake individuals find themselves exhausted by relationships that look peaceful from the outside. There is no open conflict, no dramatic chaos, just a constant, silent adjustment of the self. They confuse this with maturity, with compassion, with spiritual depth. But Jung warned that what is sacrificed unconsciously always returns as resentment, fatigue, or inner emptiness. Love, in this state, becomes asymmetrical. One person remains fully themselves. The other becomes the emotional container. And the most painful part is this. The spiritually awake often believe this imbalance is proof of their growth. They tell themselves they are holding space. They tell themselves they are more evolved. They tell themselves that love means enduring. But Jung saw something else beneath this pattern. He saw a psyche that learned, long ago, that connection was safer than authenticity. And that lesson doesn't disappear with awakening. It simply becomes more refined. We all know the story. Love at first sight. The soul recognition. The instant certainty that this is the one. We are told that real love is effortless. That it flows naturally. That if it's meant to be, it won't ask for boundaries or explanations. We are taught that unconditional love is the highest form of consciousness. To accept everything. To forgive endlessly. to stay open no matter the cost. And for a while, this idea feels beautiful. It gives meaning to sacrifice. It spiritualizes endurance. It turns emotional pain into proof of depth. If it hurts, it must be real. If it demands patience, it must be love. If you are the one who understands more, gives more, stays longer, you must be evolving. This story is especially seductive to the spiritually awake, because awareness amplifies empathy, and empathy, without grounding, turns into self-neglect. Carl Jung was deeply skeptical of love that presents itself as pure light. He understood that the psyche does not become healthy by denying its limits. It becomes healthy by recognizing them. When love is framed as something that should never disappoint, frustrate, or challenge us, it stops being a relationship and becomes an ideal. And ideals, Jung warned, are dangerous because they invite projection. We don't fall in love with the other person. We fall in love with an image, an inner figure onto which we pour our unmet longings, wounds, and unconscious needs. This is why love at first sight feels so powerful. It's not recognition. It's activation. An archetype has been awakened. And when love is built on projection, unconditional doesn't mean mature. It means unconscious. Because nothing real can survive without friction, and nothing alive can grow without limits. Jung believed the most dangerous relationships don't begin with hatred. They begin with a kind of beauty that feels fated. Two people meet, and suddenly everything feels charged. The conversation flows too easily. The chemistry feels spiritual. The connection feels like home. And that's where the confusion starts. Because what feels like home isn't always love. Sometimes it's familiarity. Sometimes it's a nervous system recognizing a pattern it learned early. Freud would have said that love often reactivates old emotional scripts, that we repeat what we couldn't resolve. Not because we want to suffer, but because the psyche is trying to master something unfinished. And later thinkers took that even further. John Bowlby, for example, showed how attachment shapes what we mistake for love, how longing, anxiety, and closeness can become tangled together so tightly. That connection feels impossible without tension. Winnicott, in his gentler way, would remind you that real intimacy requires something simple and surprisingly rare. Two people who are allowed to be real, not perfect, not constantly performing goodness to stay loved. Jung's language for all of this was different, but the insight was sharp. What we call unconditional love is often the moment we stop being a person and start being a function, a healer, a rescuer, a mirror, a container, a safe place for someone else's chaos. And it can feel spiritual because you're above ego. You're beyond needs. You're not attached. But Jung would say, if you had to disappear to keep the bond alive, that isn't transcendence. That's a loss of self. Because for Jung, love is not fusion. It's not merging into one emotional organism. It's the ability to remain distinct, while staying connected. And here's the part that shocks people. The spiritually awake often struggle with this more than anyone. Not because they are incapable of love, but because their compassion makes it easy to confuse boundaries with selfishness, and surrender with holiness. So they keep dissolving. They keep forgiving too quickly. They keep calling self-erasure unconditional. Until the psyche finally pushes back. Not with anger at the other person, but with something quieter. Numbness, fatigue, a strange loss of attraction. A feeling of being trapped inside a version of yourself that's good, but not true. And that's when the real question begins. If unconditional love is the highest virtue, why does your soul feel smaller every time you practice it? There is a reason soulmate love feels sacred. It doesn't arrive like ordinary attraction. It arrives with meaning. The moment feels charged. The timing feels impossible to ignore. The connection feels as if it was waiting for you long before you were aware of it. Many spiritually awake people describe it the same way. A sense of recognition, a feeling of destiny, the quiet certainty that this person sees them. And in a way, that feeling is real, but not in the way most people think. Carl Jung understood that moments like this are rarely about the other person alone. They are about projection. When the psyche encounters someone who resonates with its unconscious content, it doesn't see the person clearly. It sees an image, an inner figure, an archetype, everything that has been unlived, unexpressed, or disowned within the self, is suddenly mirrored back through another human being. This is why soulmate love feels so expansive at first. You're not just meeting someone. You're encountering parts of yourself that have been waiting to be seen. The shadow, the wounded inner child, the unlived life. Jung believed this experience could feel transcendent, because it temporarily dissolves in a fragmentation. But here's the danger. When we confuse projection with love, we hand our wholeness to another person. They become the carrier of our meaning, the source of our vitality, the place where we go to feel complete. And the spiritually awake are especially vulnerable to this trap, because awareness gives language to emotion, sensitivity gives depth to connection, and intuition gives the illusion of certainty. It feels like knowing, but knowing is not the same as seeing. Other thinkers notice this too, each in their own way. Eric Fromm warned that modern love often becomes a form of escape, a way of avoiding the difficult work of developing a mature self. James Hillman later spoke about how soul connections ignite imagination more than reality, pulling us into myth rather than relationship. Even modern neuroscience echoes this insight. The early stages of intense bonding flood the brain with meaning, not truth. Chemistry amplifies narrative. Emotion fills in the gaps. For a while, it's intoxicating. Everything feels aligned. Every conversation feels profound. Every conflict feels meant to teach something. And this is where unconditional love enters the story. Because once the projection is activated, the spiritually awake often feel a moral obligation to maintain it. They don't want to break the illusion. They don't want to fall back asleep. They don't want to admit that something so powerful could also be distorted. So they start compensating. They explain away red flags as lessons. They reframe incompatibility as growth. They call emotional imbalance divine timing. They tell themselves that love should transcend discomfort, that spiritual maturity means staying open, no matter how painful it becomes. But Jung was clear about this. Projection cannot survive contact with reality. Eventually, the other person fails the archetypal role they were given. They don't live up to the image. They disappoint. They withdraw. They become human. And when that happens, something breaks. The spiritually awake often respond in one of two ways. They either try harder, loving more, forgiving faster, shrinking further, in a desperate attempt to preserve the sacred feeling, or they collapse inward, confused by the sudden loss of meaning, unable to understand why something that felt so right now feels so empty. This is where the shadow enters. Not as darkness, but as exhaustion. Not as anger, but as quiet self-betrayal. Jung believed that projection is not a mistake. It's an invitation to reclaim what we gave away. Because the qualities we see in the soulmate were never meant to live outside of us forever. They were meant to be integrated. And until that happens, unconditional love remains dangerous. Not because love is wrong, but because love without consciousness becomes a substitute for wholeness. And the spiritually awake feel this fracture deeply. They sense that something sacred is being violated, but they don't realize the violation is internal. They are not failing at love. They are being asked to turn inward. and meet the parts of themselves they tried to live through someone else. There comes a moment that almost every spiritually awake person recognizes, even if they struggle to name it. The moment when love starts asking for something unfamiliar. Not more patience, not deeper understanding, not greater compassion, but limits. This is the stage where saying no feels heavier than enduring discomfort, where expressing a need triggers guilt, where choosing yourself feels like a betrayal of everything you once believed about love. At first, it feels like regression. You question your growth. You wonder if you're becoming colder, more guarded, less open. You tell yourself that a truly evolved person wouldn't need boundaries at all. But Carl Jung saw this moment not as a failure, but as a psychological threshold. He believed that individuation begins precisely where unconscious sacrifice ends. For a long time, the spiritually awake person survives by adaptation, by reading the room, by smoothing emotional edges, by becoming what the relationship needs in order to stay intact. But eventually, the psyche resists. Not loudly, not dramatically. It resists through fatigue, through loss of desire, through a strange sense of inner withdrawal. This is the soul signaling that something essential has been missing. Boundaries appear not as walls, but as signals of self-respect. And this is why they feel so terrifying. Because for someone whose identity has been shaped by emotional attunement, a boundary feels like abandonment of the other or of love itself. Jung understood that guilt often appears when we step out of old roles. The psyche equates separation with danger, even when separation is necessary for growth. So the spiritually awake person hesitates. They negotiate with themselves. They soften their limits. They delay difficult conversations until the cost becomes unavoidable. Love without limits doesn't lead to union. It leads to invisibility. And when boundaries finally emerge, they do something unexpected. They reveal the truth of the relationship. Some connections deepen when limits are expressed. They become more honest, more balanced, more real. Others collapse, not because love wasn't present, but because it depended on self-erasure to survive. And this realization is painful, because it forces the spiritually awake to grieve not just a relationship, but an identity. The identity of the one who always understands, the one who never asks too much, the one who loves without condition. But Jung would say this grief is necessary, because only when love meets a whole person does it have the chance to become something real. The phrase unconditional love sounds like something pure, like the final form of spiritual maturity, the kind of love that never flinches, never doubts, never asks for anything back. It's the love people talk about in quotes, in wedding vows, in devotional posts, in the soft language of being the bigger person. And on the surface, it feels obviously good. Of course love should be forgiving. Of course it should be patient. Of course it should be compassionate. But Jung would have been careful with anything that sounds too clean, because the psyche doesn't become whole by polishing itself into perfection. It becomes whole by integrating what it tries to avoid. And for many spiritually awake people, unconditional love becomes a very elegant way to avoid something uncomfortable. A boundary, a truth, a confrontation, a no. In real life, the myth looks innocent. It looks like answering a message when you're exhausted, because you don't want to disappoint. It looks like listening to the same complaint for the 100th time, because they are healing. It looks like swallowing your own frustration because you don't want to lower your vibration. It looks like staying calm while your body is screaming, because you've learned that spiritual people don't get angry, they understand. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, love stops being a relationship and becomes a performance of goodness. You become the one who always makes space, the one who always explains, the one who always gives people one more chance. You tell yourself it's because you're conscious, because you see deeper, because you don't want to judge. But Jung's point was simple. Without psychological structure, there is no real encounter. Love is not the absence of conditions. It is the presence of a self. Because the moment you remove the self from love, what's left isn't spirituality. It's emptiness wearing a halo. Think about how this plays out in the small places first. You agree to plans you don't actually want. You laugh at jokes that subtly cut you. You say it's fine when it isn't fine, because you don't want to create tension. Or it's even more subtle than that. You don't even know what you want anymore. You've become so skilled at sensing what others need, so trained in adjusting your tone, your energy, your language, your timing, that your own inner signals feel faint. You become hyper-aware of their discomfort, but strangely numb toward your own. And that is exactly why Jung would call unconditional love a dangerous ideal. Because ideals invite unconscious sacrifice. They turn your instincts into something suspicious. They frame your boundaries as ego. They make your self-protection feel like moral failure. So when your intuition warns you, you override it. When your body tightens, you breathe through it. When your inner voice says, "This doesn't feel safe," you correct yourself. Nay, love should be open. But what is pushed out of consciousness doesn't disappear. Jung warned that whatever you disown within yourself returns in distorted form. So the love you tried to keep pure starts to leak shadow through the cracks. It returns as quiet resentment you don't want to admit, as fatigue you can't explain, as sudden numbness in a relationship that once felt sacred, as that strange moment when someone is talking and you're present, but something in you is already gone. And then you start feeling guilty for that too. You think, maybe I'm not as awakened as I thought. Maybe I'm becoming cold. Maybe I'm losing my heart. But Jung would say, no, this isn't your heart closing. This is your psyche refusing to keep disappearing. Because love that demands your self-erasure is not holy. It is unconscious. Real love isn't the refusal to have limits. Real love is the ability to stay present inside your limits. It's saying, I care about you, and I won't abandon myself to prove it. It's being able to disappoint someone without collapsing into shame. It's letting another person feel their emotions without rushing to fix them. It's not confusing compassion with responsibility. This is why the spiritually awake often reach a breaking point. Not because they stop loving, but because they finally start existing. And here's the paradox that shocks people. The more conscious you become, the less capable you are of unconditional love. Not because you become harsher, but because you become clearer. Individuation doesn't make love smaller. It makes it real. And real love, real relationship, always has structure. Not as punishment, not as control, but as truth. Because only when yourself is present can love become something other than sacrifice disguised as virtue. For a long time, many spiritually awake people believe that love should feel expansive all the time. Light, open, limitless. They believe that if something hurts, it means they haven't transcended enough yet. That if a relationship feels heavy, it must be teaching them something. That true love asks for patience, endurance, and silence, especially from the self. But slowly, something begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a quiet inner shift. You notice that love, when it requires you to disappear, no longer feels sacred. You realize that understanding someone doesn't mean tolerating everything. That compassion doesn't require constant self-sacrifice. And that realization can feel deeply unsettling, because it means letting go of an identity you once relied on. The identity of the one who loves without condition. The one who never asks for too much. The one who holds everything together. Jung believed this moment was not a loss of love, but the birth of something far more mature. Individuation. The process of becoming who you actually are. rather than who love taught you to be in order to survive. When the self begins to take its place, love changes its shape. It becomes quieter, more honest, less performative. You stop trying to prove your depth through endurance. You stop measuring love by how much you can tolerate. You stop confusing pain with meaning. And something surprising happens. Love becomes less dramatic, but more real. You begin to see that boundaries don't destroy connection. They reveal it. Some relationships deepen when you stop disappearing. Others fall away, not because you failed to love, but because they were built on your absence. And that loss, as painful as it is, carries a strange sense of relief. Because for the first time, you are no longer loving from a place of obligation. You are loving from presence. This is the quiet truth Jung pointed toward. Love does not require you to be unconditional. It requires you to be whole. And perhaps the most advanced stage of spiritual awakening is not learning how to love without limits, but learning how to love without leaving yourself behind. If this resonates with you, stay close, because in the next video, we'll explore what happens after this realization, when the spiritually awake begin to choose wholeness over relationships that require self-erasure. Sometimes, awakening doesn't ask you to love more. It asks you to finally arrive.